Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's far too generous an introduction. Just applying huge pressure. But my warm thanks indeed to Malcolm and to the club for the invitation to attend and to speak to you this evening. I'm honoured, I'm genuinely honoured to have been asked to propose the toast to the immortal memory of a man born but a few yards from this venue, whose family members sleep in the graveyard next to us, and whose eponymous poetic hero, Tam O'Shanter, managed to save himself from the attack of a savage, if very attractive witch, but a stone's throw from where I'm standing now. This area, as you know far better than I, is one that is alive with the language, essence and imagination of Robert Burns, and that is some 220 years after his death. So it's a real treat for me to be here. And in this immortal memory, I'm going to talk about Burns' songs and some of his poems. The political, the social, the comic, the romantic, the sentimental, and I'm even including a poem someone else wrote about him. I'm maybe not supposed to do that, but I'm going to do it. Now, if, like me, you're a fan of BBC Radio 4, especially its Sunday morning programmes, and I'm not going to advertise my addiction for the Archers, then you'll be familiar with the idea behind the programme Desert Island Discs. It's 75 this week, 75th anniversary this very week. That wonderful chat show created by the late Roy Plumley in the 1940s, where a guest is invited to talk about their life and to choose 8 different records or discs that remind them of people, moments, or events along the way. Now, I wouldn't be so bold as to affiliate myself with the guests for this programme. For goodness sake, it's been David Beckham this week. But I rather like the format, so I've pinched it for my immortal memory this evening. Like many of you here, I expect, Burns has been with me since my childhood, and he has played an increasingly important role in my life, both personally and in more recent years professionally. Now I'm privileged, as Malcolm mentioned, to be working with a group of academics on a new collected edition of his work, and I can honestly say that I learn something new about Robert Burns almost every day. So I wanted to track how this relationship has developed since my earliest memories of Burns, partly to capture this for myself, and partly to inspire you to think about a similar process yourselves. And if this is your first Burns supper, and you don't know very much about Burns, then I hope it might inspire you to go and discover a little bit more about him. It may sound over-dramatic to say that Burns has been with me longer than I can remember, and certainly long before I knew of poetry, had thought about Scotland, or learned to read or write. My father, the singer Bill McHugh, had been born into a working class family with artistic leanings, and my granny, Mary McHugh, née Denham, a formidable woman, played a very large part in his life. And as I found out only very recently, because I was relatively young when she died, she thought Burns was the greatest poet that ever lived, and in fact was the first female president of her local Lanarkshire Burns Club, and that would be probably around the 1950s, so quite a feat for a woman to be a president of a Burns Club at that time. And she instilled this love in my dad, who at the age of 14 won first prize in a Burns competition singing The Bonnie Lass of Ballochmyle, and it was given his first volume of Burns' poems and songs, which I still treasure. So my earliest memories are of my dad singing some of these songs at home. In rehearsal, because we never performed for one another at home, it wasn't like the Von Trapps, honest. But my mother was a very fine pianist, so she used to accompany him. And I remember a gorgeous setting of that stately melody, Miss Admiral Gordon Strathspey, for which Burns wrote his song for his wife Jean Armour on their honeymoon. That's "Of all the airs the wind can blow, I dearly like the west, for there the bonny lassie lives, the lassie I the best." Then you know that one. Then there was the tipsy, rather overacted Oh, Willie brewed a peck o' malt and, you know. And there was a gorgeous version also of Mary Morrison, with that beautiful moment when the young protagonist sees all the other beautiful girls in the room and realises that they aren't the one he fancies. But there was also the ultra-memorable Willie Wassell Dwalt on Tweed, a song uncomfortable in its total lack of understanding of the foundations of 21st century equality and diversity policy, but a song brimming with the glories of the Scots language, with words and images that express all aspects of Willie's wife and say a good bit about him too, with great fun and great irreverence. Willie Wassell dwells on Tweed, the spot they call it Lincoln Doddy, a creasy wabster till his trade can steal a clue on anybody. He has a wife that's dour and in, Tinkler Meiji was her mother, sick a wife as Willie had, I wadna gie a button for her. She has a knee, she has but yen, our cat has twa the very colour, 5 rusty teeth for by a stump, a clap her tongue with Diva Miller, a whiskered beard, a boot her moo, her nose and chin, they threaten never, sick a wife as Willie's wife, I wadna gie a button for her. She's bow-hooked, she's hem-shinned, a limping leg, a hand-bread shorter. She's twisted right, she's twisted left, to balance fair in ilka quarter. She has a hump upon her breast, that window that's upon her shoe, that sick a wife as Willie's wife, I wadna gie a button for her. Old Bodrum's by the ingle sits, and we her lift her face a washing, but Willie's wife is nae sae trig, she dicht her grunsy with a hushing, her wally leaves like maiden creels, her feet would file the Logan water, sick a wife as Willie's wife, I wadna gie a button for her. So maybe we ought to give Donald Trump a break, eh? Maybe he doesn't mean all these coarse things he says, and he's only just having a bit of fun. Oh, I wish that were true. So if I were honest then, I'd pick 2 discs, my first 2 discs from these early memories. I'd have to take Madame singing of the beauties of Ayrshire and the beauty of Jean Armour and that gorgeous William Marshall fiddle tune. Of all the Ayrts, I think really is a masterpiece. And I'd have to take him singing Willie Wassell to remind me of great fun and games, of my father's naughty sense of humour and timing, and his love of words. And I might also have chosen Go Fetch to Me a Pint of Wine, just for your interest, a drinking song of wartime, which he also sang with great style and swagger. Now, as a teenager, desperate to step aside from the cultural influences of parents and break out on my own, I fell for the novels of Thomas Hardy and the work of Norman McCaig, a poet loved by my young and wonderful English teacher, Miss Megan Bond. But in my final year, with her guiding us, I ended up doing a longer essay on Burns. Why? Really, because I couldn't think of anything else to do, and Dad was pushing books at me. So initially, with reluctance, I wrote about Burns's satires in his very first collection of poems, the Kilmarnock edition of 1786, and I read poems like Holy Willie's Prayer and To a Louse and The Twa Dugs, which is still one of my favourites. But one poem stood out for me at this point in my life, one of Burns's early poems. Man Was Made to Mourn is a poem set on a chill November evening, and our protagonist, the man who's writing the poem really, who I think we probably think is Burns, is walking along the banks of the Ayr, and he meets a man who looks tired and weary, he's got hoary hair. And they converse about the plight of the common man. It's a very long poem. Burns actually calls it a dirge. But there are 3 verses later on in the poem which really did something to me. The older man talks to our young protagonist, and he says, "Many and sharp the numerous ills inwoven with our frame. More pointed still, we make ourselves regret, remorse, and shame. And man, whose heaven-erected face the smiles of love adorn, man's inhumanity to man makes countless thousands mourn. See yonder poor o'er-laboured wight, so abject, mean and vile, who begs a brother of the earth to give him leave to toil. And see his lordly fellow-worm the poor petition spurn, unmindful though a weeping wife and helpless offspring mourn. If I'm designed yon lordling slave, by nature's law designed, why was an independent wish e'er planted in my mind? If not, why am I subject to his cruelty or scorn? Or why has man the will and power to make his fellow mourn?" Man was made to mourn like to a mouse opened up for me a sense of universal truth. This was the time of Margaret Thatcher, of major social discomfort on a number of levels for me. And for Burns, this was also a reality for him of the ills of tenant farming in the 18th century, a time of huge political upheaval, but also revolution in farming. For the first time in my life, I became aware of history, of Scottish history, of a story, a narrative that I should know, that I should care about. And not only did it instill in me a wish to find out more, it stayed with me. So I was watching the news with my 16-year-old son on Wednesday night, and maybe just because I was already thinking about talking about this poem, I heard those lines and thought of them when seeing the abject misery and unacceptable state of the normal man and woman in Syria. Fine poetry makes us see our lives more clearly. It helps us understand human experience. But really fine poetry resonates across time, across place. It's as relevant now as it was when it was penned. And that isn't Burns's most polished verse by any manner of means. He was a young and inexperienced poet when he wrote that in the mid-1780s. So my school dissertation led me on to university. I wasn't going to do Scottish literature, honest, I wasn't. But I took it in first year, and the rest is history. But actually, at university we spent very little time talking about Burns or learning Burns's poetry. But I did learn lots about other Scottish writers, and what I did learn was that we had a powerful and vibrant literary tradition to call our own, very busy in the present day and dating as far back as the medieval period and even further back. And in my final year, I came back to writing about Burns and his song editor George Thompson, but I'll see a wee bit more about that shortly. What I did do when I was a student was sing a lot of Burns. So my next 2 choices of Desert Island Disc would be from this time in my life. And first would be Burns's timeless love song, I Walkin' O. I'm going to come back to that at the end, but this is a very fine example of Burns finding a little fragment of a song, of an old song. We think he got this one from David Herod's manuscripts from the 1770s. And as the great Burns critic David Dykes has said, Burns had an uncanny and impressive ability to take a wee fragment, a piece of something old, and to breathe life back into it. And in this case, he took a little few lines and made a song simply about a girl who can't sleep because she's singing about the man she loves. So that would be disc number 4. And number 5 would be a love song of a different kind. I'm just going to have a sip of water. And I think you'll know this one. My heart's in the Highlands, my heart is not here. My heart's in the chasing the deer, chasing the wild deer and following the roe. My heart's in the highlands wherever I go. Farewell to the highlands, farewell to the north, the birthplace of valor, the country of worth. Wherever I wander, wherever I rove, the hills of the highlands forever I love. Farewell to the mountains high covered with snow, farewell to the straths and green valleys below, farewell to the forests and wild hanging woods, farewell to the torrents and loud pouring floods. My heart's in the highlands, my heart is not here. My heart's in the highlands, chasing the deer, chasing the wild deer and following the roe. My heart's in the highlands wherever I go. So this song opened up for me in real terms the global reach of Burns, because in 1990 and 1991 I and my husband-to-be David Hamilton were asked by the Russia-Scotland Society to go to Moscow and Petersburg in January to perform at Burns Suppers there. And in often seriously minus temperatures, you could feel the frost inside your lungs. We had the most amazing time with Russian friends and colleagues. And as part of this visit, we spent time in Russian schools, where school children, inspired by the early 20th century translations of Samuel Marshak, were encouraged to do their own translations of Burns. Well, My Heart's in the Highlands was the most popular choice by far. And I can't tell you how many times we heard new translations of My Heart's in the Highlands by young Russian folk. I hadn't sung that song before that trip to Russia, but it's been a favourite ever since. Around the same time, we made our own connection with the Northwest, and since the early 90s, we've gone every year with our own family to Ardnamurchan, just the peninsula just to the north of Mull. So I feel as if there's an even closer connection to that song just in personal terms now. But the song, of course, haunts us with a sense of clearance. It's from that part of Scotland during the time of Burns and right through the 19th century. So this is a song that appears in all the big 19th century volumes of Scottish song, and many of those volumes went with Scots across the empire and to other worlds. Nostalgic the song may be, but many of the Scots who left knew they would never return to their homeland, and so the song has taken on a certain poignancy. Burns couldn't have anticipated that. He couldn't have anticipated the role the song would play in the role of emigrant Scots, but even with the discomfort of travelling in the Highlands in the 1780s with his pal Willie Nicol, he clearly felt the power of the landscape, and he could clearly empathise with the devastating sadness of having to leave it, that's for sure. And this song also has a wonderful arrangement for voice and organ by the Estonian composer Arvo Pärt, which he wrote in 2000, illustrating to me and to us, I think, the international artistic or creative influence of Burns, which is still very much alive. disc number 6 of 8. I thought it was a tricky one because there are just so many good songs to choose from, but there is only one poetic tour de force for Burns, the piece that Burns himself knew was his towering poetic contribution, Tam O'Shanter. And I don't think I could bypass this if I were only having to go with 8 pieces of Burns to my island. Tam O'Shanter, of course, has pace, humour, moments of heightened drama, dancing, singing, and a wry moralitas about moderation. It has a Scottish sense of the supernatural, it has a real context of antiquarianism, of objects from the past, and it has a line-up of truly wonderful characters, including, of course, the valiant grey mare Meg, who we can just see going over. She loses her tail on that very bridge. And when our kids were younger, they took part in Burns competitions, as many of yours will have done, and the bees biz doot wi' angry fyke, and I can still see the enjoyment in their faces of discovering those words and that language for the first time. So the human truths within Tam O'Shanter, alongside Burns's poetic wit and craft, make this a formidable creation, and that's good enough for me. But nae man or woman can tether time nor tide, and I must move on swiftly to disc number 7, which isn't Burns at all, but it relates to a wonderful year in 2009 when we marked the 250th anniversary of Burns's birth. Now in 2009, our team at Glasgow had the most amazingly international year. We started the year with a big conference in Glasgow. We then had one in Edinburgh, who dearly wish that Burns had been theirs. Then we went to Prague and talked about Burns in Europe. Then in April we went to Vancouver and talked about the transatlantic influence of Robert Burns, all those statues and everything else. But nearer to home, my own teacher, Douglas Gifford, commissioned contemporary poets of standing to reflect on Burns and to write poems inspired by Burns's own. And the great Irish poet Seamus Heaney said yes. And he wrote a lovely poem about Burns in the Happy stanza, in Burns's own stanza form, which is the stanza used for To a Mouse. And the first part of the poem talks about his childhood in Northern Ireland, his knowledge of Ulster Scots, so similar to the Scots that Burns uses. And these last 3 verses I'm going to read to you now. So these are the last 3 verses from Seamus Heaney's poem called A Birrel for Burns. Leg-lifting, heartsome, lightsome Burns, he overflowed the well-wrought urns like buttermilk from slurping churns, rich and unruly, or dancers flying, doing turns at some wild hoolie. For Rabbie's free and Rabbie's big, his stanza may be tight and trig, but once he sets the sail and rig, away he goes, like Tam O'Shanter o'er the brig, where no one follows. And though his first tongue's gone, and word lists now get added on, and even words like strown and thrawn have to be glossed, in Burns's rhymes, they travel on and won't be lost. It's a great wee collection of poems, lots by Scottish poets too. But my final choice would have to be a song closely associated with the work I'm doing now. Burns's love song, The Lee-Rig, which I think we're going to hear later on this evening, is very close to my heart. George Thompson, who I mentioned earlier, was Burns's second song editor. The first one was James Johnson, whose pivotal collection of some 600 songs of the Scots Musical Museum, for that Burns was really a co-editor. But George Thompson, the next editor that came along, has occupied much of my professional and a good bit of my personal life really since the early 90s, and it's Burns's songs for Thompson that I'm working on just now for the new Oxford edition. Thompson isn't liked by the Burnsians. He has a rough time with them because he made some changes to Burns's songs after the poet's death. And he had the stupid idea, one critic's actually called it that, of asking composers, classical composers like Haydn and Beethoven, to set these Scottish tunes for piano, violin and cello, as if they knew anything. So it's been quite interesting reworking through all of Thomson's letters to and from Burns, and a real thrill to see the manuscripts of those letters too, I can tell you. So I'm just trying to retell the story. Now, Burns gave Thomson many of the songs that he'd published in his big collection, the Scots Musical Museum, but he wrote some others specially for this fussy new editor, and the lyric was one of those. Originally a bawdy song, one of Burns's many muses, about lying over the lee rig with your lover on a clammy night. Burns cleaned the song up for Thomson to create a beautiful song about lovers meeting in the gloaming, as we call it here. It's that supernatural time between night and day. And it's a time Burns uses really often in his love songs. He's got it in Cornriggs, and he's also got it in I Walk in O. So the lyric would be my final choice of disc. And I'm thinking about that middle verse of the song. At midnight hour in murkest glen, I'd rove and ne'er be erio, if through that glen I gaed to thee, my ain kind deario. Although the nicht were ne'er sae wet, and I were ne'er sae weario, I'd meet thee on the lee rig, my ain kind deario. I get a buzz even just reading those words, let alone listening to them, and seeing them in Burns's own hand in a very posh library in New York last year was a real thrill, real thrill, and is one of the great privileges of the job that I do. Of course, what happens at the end of Desert Island Discs is that the guest is told that they've been shipwrecked on the island and they can only have one of the discs that they've chosen, and they need to choose which one they're going to keep. Which one would I hold on to? It's a tough one. But for me, it would have to be the song I mentioned back a little while ago, the timeless love song, I Walk in O. Small but beautifully formed. It's a tiny moment in time, a never-ending night, an eternal expression of love, most simply put. What more do we need? Summer's a pleasant time, flowers o' every colour, the water runs o'er the heugh, and I long for my true lover. I walk in, oh, walking still and weary, sleep I can get nane, for thinking on my dearie. When I sleep I dream, when I walk I weary, sleep I can get nane, for thinking on my dearie. I walk in, oh, walking still and weary, sleep I can get nane, for thinking on my dearie. Lately nicht comes on, all the lave are sleeping. I think on my bonny lad, and I believe my way greeting. I walk in, oh, walking still and weary, sleep I can get nane, for thinking on my dearie. So that would be it. That would be the one I would keep. A very simple sentiment, a very simple form, a very simple and repetitive tune. And that version is an old melody which Burns publishes with the song in the Scots Musical Museum. And I apologise if you've heard the next bit, but that song reminds me that Scottish school children are always right. When your new museum opened in Alloway, the Herald ran a piece about what Scottish school children thought of Burns. The one you might appreciate is that many of them thought Burns was born in an alleyway. But my favourite was that he died of romantic fever. And that we're talking about him and celebrating the best of his art tonight, so long after all the fuss of his very short life, is testament to Burns' standing in our lives. It's not just about celebrity. It's because Burns did and continues to do something very special in the work he left behind him. Ladies and gentlemen, please may I ask you to be upstanding if you're able and raise your glasses. And allow me to propose the toast to the immortal memory of Robert Burns. Thank you.